cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and most cancers are not diseases that appear suddenly. They are processes that develop over years or decades, producing measurable biomarker changes long before they produce symptoms. The Diabetes Prevention Program, one of the most important clinical trials in modern preventive medicine, found that lifestyle interventions reduced type 2 diabetes incidence by 58% in high-risk adults. But these interventions were only possible because the participants had regular blood monitoring that identified their risk status before they became diabetic. The habit of regular health monitoring doesn't treat disease. It creates the window of opportunity to prevent it. That window, once closed by progression to full disease, rarely reopens. The medical concept of the silent killer, diseases that progress without symptoms until a crisis event, applies to hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, prediabetes, fatty liver disease, and early-stage cancers. These conditions affect tens of millions of people who feel completely healthy. The fundamental problem is that subjective health experience is a poor proxy for objective health status, particularly for metabolic and cardiovascular conditions that produce no pain, fatigue, or obvious dysfunction during their most treatable stages. Regular health monitoring converts invisible risk into visible data, enabling the lifestyle and medical interventions that have the highest probability of changing outcomes. The evidence for regular health monitoring draws from preventive medicine, behavioral health research, and longitudinal biomarker studies. Today's sources include the Diabetes Prevention Program, one of the largest prevention trials ever conducted, and research on how self-monitoring and quantitative feedback drive health behavior change. The average American sees a physician once per year, if they see one at all. Many adults go years between medical evaluations. During these unmonitored periods, metabolic risk factors silently progress. Blood pressure creeps upward, fasting glucose rises toward pre-diabetic ranges, LDL increases with dietary changes, testosterone or thyroid level shift. By the time these changes become symptomatic, heart attack, stroke, diagnosed diabetes, they have typically been developing for a decade or more. The cultural norm of reactive medicine, only seeking evaluation when something feels wrong, is physiologically inappropriate for diseases that don't feel wrong until they become crises. The biggest myth about health monitoring is that it's only for sick people or those with family history of specific diseases, that healthy young adults don't need regular blood work. This framing ignores the epidemiology. Cardiovascular risk begins accumulating in the 20s and 30s. Prediabetes affects nearly 40% of American adults, predominantly affecting people under 65. Thyroid dysfunction, vitamin D deficiency, low testosterone or estrogen, and subclinical anemia are all common conditions that affect energy, cognition, and health at their biological peaks, and all are undetectable without objective measurement. The monitoring habit doesn't become relevant when you feel sick. It is most valuable when you feel completely fine. The Diabetes Prevention Program, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, remains one of the most compelling demonstrations of what monitoring enables. Over 3,000 adults with impaired glucose tolerance, detected by blood monitoring, were randomized to intensive lifestyle intervention, metformin, or placebo. The lifestyle group, who received intensive support for diet and physical activity changes, showed a 58% reduction in diabetes incidence compared to placebo over approximately 3 years. The critical point: all participants were identified through monitoring before they developed symptoms. Without the monitoring that detected their pre-diabetic status, none of them would have had the opportunity to intervene. The behavioral science of health monitoring shows that quantitative feedback powerfully drives behavior change in ways that subjective self-assessment does not. Bonnie Spring and colleagues at Northwestern University showed that self-monitoring of diet, physical activity, and weight predicted successful health behavior change more strongly than any other factor in a meta-analysis of behavior change interventions. The mechanism is straightforward. Quantitative feedback closes the loop between intention and outcome, reveals gaps invisible to subjective perception, and provides the concrete targets that motivate specific behavioral adjustments. What gets measured gets managed, and what doesn't get measured often doesn't get noticed until it's a problem. Bonnie Spring and colleagues at Northwestern University conducted a systematic review of self-monitoring interventions in health behavior change. Across studies of dietary monitoring, physical activity tracking, and clinical biomarker monitoring, self-monitoring was consistently one of the strongest predictors of behavior change success. The mechanism involves multiple pathways. Quantitative feedback creates accountability, reveals patterns invisible to subjective perception, enables goal setting with concrete targets, and produces the psychological commitment that follows any behavioral audit. The research also showed that the frequency of monitoring matters. More frequent feedback produced stronger behavior change than infrequent assessment. Building a health monitoring habit requires establishing two distinct monitoring cadences: annual comprehensive blood work panels and more frequent self-monitoring of readily measurable variables. The annual panel provides the deep biomarker picture: metabolic, cardiovascular, hormonal, and inflammatory markers. The frequent self-monitoring of blood pressure, resting heart rate, sleep duration, and body weight provides the dynamic feedback between annual panels that enables responsive behavior adjustment. Comparing health outcomes between people who practice regular health monitoring versus those who only seek care reactively reveals substantial differences in early disease detection rates, intervention success, and mortality risk. The data are particularly striking for metabolic and cardiovascular outcomes, the two most common causes of preventable death in the developed world, both of which have long asymptomatic treatable phases that regular monitoring can detect. The evidence-based health monitoring framework has three tiers. First, the annual comprehensive panel, complete metabolic panel, lipid panel, CBC, HbA1c, inflammatory markers, CRP, homocysteine, vitamin D, iron panel, and relevant hormonal markers. Second, home monitoring, a blood pressure cuff used weekly, a scale used consistently, and a sleep tracker for trend analysis. Third, wearable integration, continuous or regular heart rate variability monitoring, which provides real-time insight into recovery status, stress load, and autonomic nervous system function. Each tier provides different temporal resolution of your health data. The health monitoring habit loop is unique in that it produces both immediate and long-term rewards. The immediate reward is information, the psychological comfort of knowing rather than wondering, and the specific actionable data that enables targeted behavior change. The long-term reward is the disease prevention that the information enables. Building the monitoring habit requires scheduling it like any other important appointment. It will not happen reliably through spontaneous motivation. Build your health monitoring habit with 5 concrete actions. Schedule a comprehensive blood panel with your physician this month. If you haven't had one in the past year, this is your highest priority action. Buy a clinically validated blood pressure cuff and measure weekly, not occasionally. Track your weight consistently at the same time each day for trend data rather than isolated readings. Set annual birthday reminders as health panel prompts. A memorable date prevents the monitoring from being indefinitely delayed. And review your results with your physician to understand what they mean for your specific risk profile. Health monitoring habit failure typically reflects one of 3 patterns: postponing the annual panel indefinitely, interpreting a single bad reading catastrophically rather than as one data point, or failing to act on abnormal results. Pre-planning responses to each of these scenarios prevents the monitoring habit from becoming a source of anxiety rather than empowerment. Most of the conditions that kill people prematurely, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and many cancers, have long asymptomatic phases during which lifestyle interventions have the greatest efficacy. The Diabetes Prevention Program showed that a 58% reduction in diabetes incidence is achievable in people identified by monitoring before they develop symptoms. Self-monitoring is the strongest single predictor of health behavior change. The monitoring habit requires only annual blood work and consistent home measurement of blood pressure and weight, tools that are universally accessible and reveal the health risks that subjective well-being cannot. Today, book a blood test. Not next month. Today. You cannot optimize what you cannot measure. Subscribe to Habits, backed by science, every week, the evidence on what actually moves the needle on health and performance. The data you collect today may be the most important thing you do for your future self.